John Kennedy buys a sick bull out of compassion, unaware that it hides a surprising secret. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Louisiana countryside, painting the fields in hues of gold and amber, as John Kennedy steered his truck along a winding back road. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and distant rain, a welcome change from the sterile hum of Senate chambers and the endless buzz of Washington. He'd come out here to escape, to find a moment of quiet, where the weight of legislation and public scrutiny couldn't follow. His only plan was to drive, to let the open land and the hum of cicadas clear his mind. But as he passed a weathered sign pointing to a small cattle ranch, something stirred a pull he couldn't name, like a whisper from the past. He slowed his hands tightening on the wheel and turned down the dusty path, unaware that this impulsive detour would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. The ranch came into view modest and worn, its fences sagging under the weight of time. A few cows dotted the sparse pasture, their heads bowed to the grass, while an old red barn stood at the edge, its paint flaking like autumn leaves. Kennedy parked near a rusted gate, stepping out into the warm, heavy air. His boots crunched on gravel as he scanned the place, taking in the quiet pride of a working ranch, even one past its prime. An older man emerged from the barn, his face etched with lines carved by sun and hard years. He wiped his hands on a faded rag, eyeing Kennedy with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Afternoon," the man said, tipping a sweat-stained hat. "I'm Henry. You looking for something or just lost?" Kennedy offered a small, easy smile. "Just passing through, thought I'd take a look." "Got anything worth showing?" Henry's laugh was dry, tinged with resignation. "Most of my stock's decent, but nothing fancy. There's one, though. He's a different kind of story." He nodded toward the barn, his expression shifting to something softer, almost mournful, and led the way. Inside the barn was dim, the air thick with the musty warmth of hay, and a sharper, unsettling smell that made Kennedy's chest tighten. Henry guided him to a corner stall where a black bull lay sprawled on a bed of fresh straw. The animal was massive, its frame still imposing despite the ravages of illness. Its coat, once sleek, was dull and patchy, its ribs stark against its hide. Each breath came slow, labored, a faint wheeze, cutting through the silence. But it was the bull's eyes that stopped Kennedy, cold, dark, deep, and holding a quiet dignity that seemed to demand respect. The animal's head rested heavily, but as Kennedy stepped closer, it lifted slightly, meeting his gaze with an intensity that felt almost personal. "This is Faith," Henry said, his voice low, reverent. "Named him when he was a calf, thought it'd bring him luck. Seems I got that wrong." Kennedy crouched, his eyes locked on the bull. "What's wrong with him?" he asked, his tone steady but softer than usual. Henry leaned against the stall, his hat in his hands. "Fever's been burning through him for weeks. Vet says it's an infection gone too deep. He don't eat, barely drinks. Maybe a week left if he's lucky. I was planning to put him down tomorrow. Kinder that way." Kennedy didn't answer right away. He studied Faith, the slow rise and fall of the bull's chest, the faint tremor in its limbs. Something about the animal hit him hard, stirring memories he hadn't touched in years. His father's tales of their family's old farm, the way his grandfather used to say, every creature deserved a chance to fight its battles. Kennedy had seen struggle before in the faces of constituents, in the quiet grief of friends, but this bull, broken and defiant in a forgotten stall, was different. It wasn't just pity. It was a call, a need to act that he couldn't ignore. "How much for him?" he asked, standing his voice firm with a resolve that surprised even him. Henry blinked, his brow furrowing. "You're joking, right, Senator? This bull's done for. Ain't right to take your money for a dying animal." Kennedy's gaze didn't waver. I'm not asking if it's right. I'm asking how much. Henry hesitated, clearly thrown, then muttered, 200, I guess. More than he's worth now. Kennedy reached for his wallet, pulling out 600 in crisp bills and pressing them into Henry's hand. Get him ready. I'll have a truck here in a few hours. Henry shook his head, mumbling about stubborn city folks. But Kennedy was already on his phone calling Clara, his longtime friend and ranch manager. I need a stall set up at my place, he said, his tone clipped but certain. And get Dr. Ellis, the vet from Baton Rouge. I'm bringing home a bull. Clara's voice crackled with disbelief. A bull, John? You don't know a thing about cattle. What's this about? He glanced at Faith, whose eyes still held his unyielding despite the pain. It's about doing what's right, he said simply. Just make it happen. Clara sighed but agreed, and Kennedy pocketed his phone, turning back to Henry. Why Faith? He asked, the name lingering in his mind. Henry shrugged, a faint smile breaking through. My granddaughter chose it. Said he looked like he believed in something even as a wobbly calf. Kids see things we don't. Kennedy nodded, the name settling into him like a vow. Faith. It fit somehow like a promise he was making to himself and the animal. While waiting for the transport truck, Kennedy wandered the ranch's edge, his boots sinking into the soft, loamy soil. The sky had deepened to a fiery orange, the kind of sunset that made Louisiana feel like a world apart. He thought about his life decades in politics, the compromises, the victories that never felt as clean as he'd hoped. He'd fought for people, for principles, but this was different. This was about one life, one chance, a fight most would have walked away from. He knew Faith might not survive, that the odds were stacked against them, but he'd learned long ago that the battles worth fighting were the ones others called lost. Back at the barn, Henry was securing a halter on Faith the bull, too weak to protest. You sure about this? Henry asked, his eyes searching Kennedy's face. This ain't gonna be easy. Kennedy met his gaze unflinching. Nothing worth it ever is, he said. I'm not backing down. The transport truck rolled in as dusk settled, its headlights slicing through the growing dark. 2 ranch hands sent by Clara worked with Henry to load Faith into a padded trailer, the bull sedated for the journey. Kennedy watched every move, his hands clenched, as if his determination could keep the animal alive. The drive to his property, a sprawling retreat he'd bought years ago for moments like these, was silent. He didn't touch the radio, didn't check his messages. His mind was with Faith, with the way the bull's gaze had held his, like they'd struck an unspoken deal. When he arrived, Clara was waiting. Her arms crossed, her expression a mix of irritation and concern. You've lost it, you know, that she said, leading him to the barn where a clean stall waited. This better not be some kind of stunt. Kennedy's lips twitched. If it is, it's a damn expensive one, he said, but his eyes were on the trailer where Faith was being unloaded. Dr. Ellis arrived soon after, a lean man with a brisk, no-nonsense air. He examined Faith, his hands quick and precise, checking the bull's pulse, eyes, and temperature. Septicemia, most likely, he said, stepping back. Infection's gone systemic. I can start antibiotics and fluids, but his chances are slim, 10%, maybe less. Kennedy's face was unreadable. Then we work with the 10%, he said. Whatever he needs, meds, equipment, anything. Give him a shot. Ellis studied him, then nodded. All right, Senator. I'll set him up, but don't expect miracles. Kennedy didn't respond, watching as Ellis and Clara rigged an IV line, settling Faith onto a thick bed of straw. The bull's breathing was ragged, but there was a stubborn spark in its eyes, a refusal to surrender, that Kennedy recognized. He'd seen it in himself, in the fights he'd taken on when others had given up. By midnight, the barn was still lit only by a single bulb that cast long shadows across the dirt floor. Clara tried to coax Kennedy to the house, but he shook his head. "I'm staying," he said, dragging a stool near the stall. Clara muttered something about stubborn fools but left him be, her footsteps fading into the night. Kennedy sat his elbows on his knees, watching Faith. The bull's eyes flickered open meeting his, and Kennedy felt a strange calm settle over him. "You're a fighter," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "So am I. Let's see this through." He didn't know why he was talking to a dying bull, but it felt right, like a pact sealed in the quiet. As the hours passed, the moon rose, spilling silver through the barn's windows, and Kennedy stayed his resolve as steady as the bull's faint breaths, knowing this was only the beginning. The barn had become John Kennedy's sanctuary, a place where the world's noise, Senate votes, news cycles, endless emails faded into the soft rustle of straw and the rhythmic breathing of Faith. 2 weeks had passed since he'd brought the black bull to his Louisiana property, and though Faith was still frail, the animal's stubborn will to live had begun to show. The fever had eased, and the bull now stood for short periods, its dark eyes brighter, more alert. Kennedy spent every spare moment in the barn drawn by a connection he couldn't explain. He wasn't a sentimental man, but something about Faith's quiet resilience spoke to him like a challenge to keep fighting, no matter the odds. Clara, his ranch manager, had stopped questioning his obsession, though her raised eyebrows said enough. Even Dr. Ellis, the veterinarian, seemed cautiously optimistic, noting that Faith's recovery, while slow, was defying his initial prognosis. But it wasn't just the bull's health that intrigued Kennedy. It was the way Faith seemed to affect those around him, a subtle shift in the air that he couldn't quite name. One morning, as Kennedy hauled a bucket of fresh water to the stall, he noticed young Sam, the part-time ranch hand, sitting cross-legged near Faith. The kid was reading aloud from a dog-eared comic book, his voice animated as he narrated a superhero's battle against a galactic tyrant. Faith's head was tilted slightly as if listening, and Kennedy paused in the doorway, struck by the scene. Sam glanced up, startled, and scrambled to his feet. "Sorry, Senator, I didn't see you there. Just thought he might like a story." Kennedy waved off the apology, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No harm done. He seemed to enjoy it." Sam grinned, relaxing. "Think so. He don't fidget as much when I read to him. My mom says animals can tell when you're trying to help." Kennedy nodded, watching as Faith's ears flicked toward Sam's voice. "Your mom's got a point," he said, setting the bucket down. "Keep it up, Sam. He's lucky to have you." The boy beamed, settling back with his comic, and Kennedy felt a warmth he hadn't expected. Faith wasn't just his project anymore. The bull was weaving itself into the lives of others, quietly pulling them together. That afternoon, Clara burst into the barn, her face flushed with urgency. "John, you need to come see this. It's about Ellie, the housekeeper's girl." Kennedy followed her to the main house where Maria, his longtime housekeeper, stood in the kitchen wringing her hands. Her daughter Ellie, a shy 7-year-old, sat at the table sipping juice, her cheeks no longer flushed with the fever that had kept her home from school for days. Maria's voice trembled as she explained. "She was burning up last night, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. I was going to take her to the clinic today, but this morning she's fine, like it never happened." Kennedy frowned, confused. "That's good news, Maria, but what's got you so rattled?" Maria hesitated, glancing at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. It's your bull, Senator." Ellie snuck out to the barn yesterday before she got worse. She said she wanted to see Faith. I found her sitting by his stall, talking to him. She said he looked at her, and she felt better, like her head stopped hurting. I didn't think much of it, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and Kennedy felt a prickle at the back of his neck. "Kids bounce back fast," he said, trying to sound practical, but his mind was racing. Ellie, still at the table, piped up, her voice small but clear. "Faith's nice. He's got kind eyes. Can I see him again?" Kennedy managed a nod. His thoughts tangled. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more to Faith? The incident with Ellie lingered in Kennedy's mind, gnawing at him as he went about his days. He started paying closer attention to Faith, noticing things he hadn't before. The bull was unusually calm around people, even strangers, its massive frame radiating a quiet steadiness that put others at ease. When Sam read to Faith, the boy's usual nervous energy seemed to melt away, replaced by a confidence Kennedy hadn't seen in him. Clara, too, had taken to lingering in the barn, claiming she was just checking supplies, but Kennedy caught her once stroking Faith's muzzle, her face softer than he'd ever seen. It was as if the bull was a magnet, drawing out something gentle in everyone who came near. Kennedy wasn't one for flights of fancy. He'd built his career on facts and reason, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Faith was more than just an animal. He started keeping a small notebook, jotting down observations. Faith's improving appetite, the way its coat was regaining its sheen, and most curiously, the effect it seemed to have on people. He didn't share these thoughts with anyone, not yet. They felt too fragile, too strange, like a puzzle he hadn't solved. A few days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Kennedy was in the barn, cleaning Faith's stall, when Clara called him to the house. "Some old guy named Thomas is here," she said. "Says he knows about your bull." Kennedy wiped his hands and headed to the porch, where a man in his late 70s waited, his face weathered like old leather, a faded hat clutched in his hands. "Senator Kennedy," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I'm Thomas Reed. Used to run a small outfit not far from here. Heard you bought a black bull one with a white patch on its shoulder shaped like a crescent moon." Kennedy's pulse quickened. Faith had exactly that mark, though he hadn't mentioned it to anyone outside the ranch. "That's right," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "How'd you know?" Thomas's eyes crinkled, a mix of nostalgia and something deeper. "Because I raised him. Sold him a few years back when times got tough. His name's Faith. My wife picked it, said he had a spirit that wouldn't quit. When I heard you'd taken him in half dead, and all I had to come see for myself." Kennedy invited Thomas inside, offering him a glass of iced tea as they sat at the kitchen table. The old man's story unfolded slowly, each word carrying the weight of memory. He'd been a cattleman his whole life, specializing in hardy breeds suited to Louisiana's humid summers. Faith had been born during a fierce thunderstorm, the only calf of a cow that didn't survive the birth. Thomas and his wife Laya had bottle-fed the calf, nursing it through those fragile early weeks. He was different even then, Thomas said, staring into his glass. Laya used to say he had a knowing look, like he understood more than a bull ought to. She swore he'd sit by her when she was feeling low, like he was keeping her company. Kennedy listened, his skepticism warring with curiosity. "Sounds like quite an animal," he said carefully. Thomas nodded, his expression turning serious. "There's more. Lila kept a journal, wrote about all our animals, but Faith. She wrote pages about him. Said he wasn't just special, he was sacred. Tied to old stories from the Choctaw folks around here about animals that carry a gift, a kind of healing. I didn't believe her at first, thought it was just her way of coping with hard times. But after what happened with Ellie, I'm not so sure." Kennedy's grip tightened on his glass. "You heard about Ellie?" Thomas gave a small nod. "Word travels in these parts. Maria's cousin works at my old ranch. Said the girl was sick as a dog, then fine the next day after sitting with your bull. Lila would have said, "That's no coincidence." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. This was Lila's. She passed a few years back, but she'd want you to have it. Maybe it'll help you understand what you've got here. Kennedy took the notebook, its weight heavier than it should have been. He flipped it open, skimming Lila's neat handwriting notes about feed schedules, weather patterns, and then tucked among the mundane entries about Faith. One caught his eye. "Faith stayed by the gate all morning, while I cried over the doctor's news. My headaches eased like he took the pain away. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt stronger after." Kennedy closed the book, his throat tight. "Thanks for this," he said, meeting Thomas's gaze. "I'll read it. And you're welcome to see Faith any time." Thomas smiled, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "I'd like that. He's in good hands, Senator." Lila would have approved. That evening, Kennedy sat in his study, Lila's journal open before him. The house was quiet, Clara, and the hands gone for the day, leaving only the distant chirp of crickets. He read slowly, each entry painting a picture of a bull that seemed to sense human suffering. Lila described neighbors who'd felt better after visiting Faith crops, that thrived, where he grazed even a stray dog that stopped limping after sleeping near his stall. She mentioned Choctaw legends, stories of spirit animals that bridged the physical and spiritual worlds, carrying a light that healed. Kennedy rubbed his eyes, torn between disbelief and the evidence piling up around him. Ellie's recovery, Sam's newfound calm, Clara's softening demeanor, it all pointed to something he couldn't dismiss, no matter how much his rational mind protested. He thought of Faith alone in the barn and felt a sudden urge to check on him. The barn was bathed in moonlight as Kennedy approached, the air cool and sharp. Faith stood in his stall, stronger now, his head raised as if expecting him. Kennedy stepped closer, his hand resting on the stall door. "What are you?" "Huh?" he murmured, half expecting an answer. Faith's eyes met his, steady and deep, and for a moment Kennedy swore he saw a faint glow, like a shimmer of starlight around the bull's frame. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving him wondering if he'd imagined it. He stayed there for hours, Lila's journal tucked under his arm, the weight of possibility settling over him. Faith wasn't just a bull, he was a mystery, a gift, and maybe a responsibility Kennedy wasn't sure he was ready to carry. But as he watched Faith settle back onto the straw, he knew one thing for certain: whatever this animal was, he'd protect it, even if it meant stepping into a world he didn't fully understand. The Louisiana summer had settled in, heavy and humid, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made every breath feel like a labor. John Kennedy barely noticed his days anchored to the barn where Faith, the black bull he'd rescued, continued his improbable recovery. The bull's coat now gleamed under the sunlight that streamed through the barn's high windows, and he moved with a cautious strength, no longer the skeletal creature Kennedy had found months ago. But it wasn't just Faith's health that held Kennedy's attention. It was the growing sense that the bull was more than he seemed, a suspicion fueled by Lila's journal and the strange calm that enveloped anyone who spent time near him. Kennedy had started to see patterns, small, inexplicable moments that piled up like stones in a river, redirecting his thoughts. Maria's daughter Ellie had recovered from her fever after sitting with Faith. Sam, the young ranch hand, had grown steadier, his usual teenage awkwardness fading in the bull's presence. Even Clara, ever practical, admitted the barn felt different, like a place where worries loosened their grip. Kennedy kept these observations in his notebook, a private record he shared with no one, not even Thomas, the old cattleman who had first hinted at Faith's extraordinary nature. One evening, as Kennedy swept the barn floor, Maria appeared at the door, her face pale despite the heat. "Senator, it's my mother," she said, her voice tight. "She's been sick for weeks," Her heart, the doctors say. They're talking about surgery, but she's so weak, they're not sure she'll make it. Kennedy set the broom aside, his chest tightening. Maria's mother, Rosa, had been a fixture at the ranch's community dinners, a woman with a laugh that could fill a room. "I'm sorry, Maria," he said. "What can I do?" Maria hesitated, twisting the hem of her apron. "I know it sounds foolish, but after what happened with Ellie, I thought maybe if Mama could see your bull it might help, just for a little while." Kennedy's first instinct was to dismiss the idea Rosa was seriously ill, not a child with a passing fever. But Lila's journal flashed in his mind her meticulous notes about faith's effect on people, the Choctaw tales of spirit animals that healed. He looked at Maria, saw the desperation in her eyes, and nodded. "Bring her tomorrow," he said. "We'll make it work." Maria's shoulders sagged with relief, and she murmured a quiet thank you before hurrying off. The next morning, Kennedy and Clara rearranged the barn, setting up a shaded area just outside Faith's stall with a comfortable chair and a small table for Rosa's medications. Dr. Ellis, skeptical but willing to humor Kennedy, agreed to monitor the visit, bringing a portable oxygen tank and a blood pressure cuff. Rosa arrived in a wheelchair pushed by Maria, her frail frame draped in a light shawl. Her breathing was shallow, her skin ashen, but her eyes lit up when she saw Faith. "What a beautiful creature," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kennedy guided Faith to the edge of the stall, the bull moving with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate. Rosa reached out a trembling hand, and Faith lowered his head, letting her fingers brush his muzzle. For nearly an hour, she sat there talking softly to the bull in Spanish, her words too quiet for Kennedy to catch. Maria watched, tears brimming, while Ellis checked Rosa's vitals, his brow furrowed. When it was time to leave, Rosa seemed calmer, her breathing less labored. "He's special," she said to Kennedy, gripping his hand. "I felt it." Kennedy nodded, unsure what to say, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Over the next few days, Rosa's condition improved. Maria called with updates, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. Rosa was eating again, her heart rate stabilizing. The doctors, baffled, postponed the surgery, saying she might not need it if the trend continued. Kennedy visited the barn each evening, watching Faith closely. The bull seemed tired, his movements slower, his appetite diminished. Ellis confirmed what Kennedy feared: Faith's vitals were slipping, not drastically, but enough to raise concern. "Could be a coincidence," Ellis said, but his tone lacked conviction. Kennedy thought of Lila's journal, her notes about Faith weakening after helping others, and a knot formed in his stomach. Was the bull paying a price for Rosa's recovery? He called Thomas, who arrived the next day, his weathered face grave as he listened to Kennedy's account. "Lila wrote about this," Thomas said, sitting on a hay bale near Faith's stall. "She believed Faith took on the pain, the sickness like a sponge. The old Choctaw stories call it a balance, life for life, strength for strength. He'll recover, but it takes time." Kennedy's jaw tightened. "And if he does this too often, what?" Then Thomas met his gaze unflinching. "Then he might not make it. That's the weight of his gift." The idea haunted Kennedy, but before he could grapple with it, another crisis hit. His old friend James, a lawyer from New Orleans, called late one night, his voice raw. "John, I'm in trouble," he said. "Got a diagnosis last week, cancer advanced. They're giving me months, maybe less." Kennedy felt the air leave his lungs. James had been a constant in his life, a man who'd stood by him through campaigns and personal storms. "Come to the ranch," Kennedy said almost without thinking. "Bring your family. We'll figure something out." James arrived 2 days later with his wife Sarah and their teenage daughter Lily. He was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, but he managed a weak smile as Kennedy greeted him. "Never thought I'd be hiding out in your cowshed," James joked, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. Kennedy didn't mention Faith at first, unsure how to broach the subject without sounding unhinged. Instead, he let James settle in, giving him time to rest in the guest house. The next morning, Kennedy took James to the barn, framing it as a tour of the property. Faith was grazing in a small paddock, his crescent moon mark stark against his black coat. James leaned against the fence, watching the bull with a quiet intensity. "He's something else," he said, his voice soft. "Makes you feel, I don't know, lighter." Kennedy seized the moment. "Sit with him for a bit," he suggested. "He's good company." James raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue, settling into a chair Clara had set up. Faith ambled over, standing close, his massive head lowered as if in conversation. Sarah and Lily joined them, and for hours the family stayed near Faith, talking, laughing, and sometimes just sitting in silence. Kennedy watched from a distance, his heart pounding. He saw the same calm he'd noticed with Rosa, the same easing of tension, but he also saw Faith's head droop, his steps falter as the day wore on. By the third day, James was different, stronger. His color, better, his laughter, genuine. Sarah confided in Kennedy, her voice trembling. "The doctors can't explain it, but his blood work's improved. They're running more tests, but it's like he's fighting back." Kennedy wanted to rejoice, but his eyes were on Faith, now lying in his stall, barely touching his feed. Ellis's latest exam was grim. Faith's heart rate was irregular, his energy drained. "It's like he's carrying something heavy," Ellis said, shaking his head. Kennedy called Thomas again, and the old man's words were stark. "He's doing what he's meant to do, but it's costing him. You've got to decide how far you'll let this go." That night, Kennedy sat by Faith's stall, Lila's journal open in his lap. The entries were clear. Faith had weakened before always recovering, but never this severely. The Choctaw tales spoke of spirit animals giving their strength willingly, but Kennedy couldn't shake the guilt. Was he asking too much of Faith? Was he exploiting a gift he didn't fully understand? The next morning, he made a decision. He told Maria and James that Faith needed rest, that no one could visit the barn for a while. Maria nodded, grateful for her mother's recovery, but James protested, his fear resurfacing. "John, if that bull's helping, why stop now?" Kennedy held firm, his voice steady but heavy. "Because he's not a machine. He's alive, and he's hurting. We've got to give him a chance to heal, same as we're giving you." James relented, but the conversation left Kennedy shaken. He spent the day with Faith, cleaning the stall, refilling the water trough, talking to the bull in low tones. "You've done enough," he said, his hand resting on Faith's shoulder. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." Faith's eyes met his, steady and deep, and Kennedy felt a resolve settle over him. Whatever Faith was, animal spirit or something beyond, he'd protect him, even if it meant saying no to those he loved. The weight of that choice was heavy, but as he looked at Faith, he knew it was right. The bull had given him a glimpse of something extraordinary, and now it was his job to honor it, no matter what came next. The barn stood quiet, under a sky streaked with the soft pinks and purples of a Louisiana dusk, the kind that made the world feel gentle, forgiving. John Kennedy leaned against the fence of Faith's paddock, watching the black bull graze his crescent moon mark, catching the fading light. Months had passed since the harrowing days when Faith's strength had wavered, drained by the mysterious gift that seemed to heal those around him. The bull was stronger now, his frame filled out, his eyes bright with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn Kennedy to him. But the weight of what Faith had revealed, a power to absorb pain and give back life, had changed Kennedy, carving a new path through his thoughts. He'd seen it in Rosa's renewed laughter, in James's improbable remission, in the way young Ellie now ran through the fields, her fever a distant memory. Yet each miracle came at a cost, and Kennedy had vowed to protect Faith, to ensure the bull's gift was honored, not exploited. That vow had led him here to a decision that felt both inevitable and daunting. After Faith's near collapse, Kennedy had closed the barn to visitors, giving the bull time to recover under Dr. Ellis's careful watch and Thomas's quiet guidance. The old cattleman had become a fixture at the ranch, his weathered hands tending to Faith, with a reverence born of years spent with animals and the stories of his late wife, Leela. Thomas had shared more about the Choctaw legends, tales of spirit animals that carried a sacred balance, giving strength, but needing rest to replenish their own. Faith's like a well, Thomas had said one evening, his voice low as they sat by the paddock. He can give, but if you draw too much, he'll run dry. The words stuck with Kennedy, shaping his next steps. He'd bought a secluded parcel of land at the edge of his property, a quiet stretch of green, bordered by oaks and a small creek. There, with Thomas's help, he built a sanctuary for Faith, a spacious corral, a shaded stall, and a simple cabin for Thomas to live nearby. The goal was clear, a place where Faith could live in peace, helping only those in dire need, away from curious eyes or greedy hands. The sanctuary's first test came sooner than Kennedy expected. A local pastor, a friend of Clara's, reached out about a parishioner named Grace, a woman in her 40s, battling a rare illness that left her bedridden, her hope fading. The doctors had little to offer, and the pastor, having heard whispers of Faith's effect on Rosa and James, asked if Grace could visit. Kennedy hesitated, his mind flashing to Faith's labored breathing after James's recovery. But Thomas, after checking Faith's health, gave a cautious nod. "He's strong now," the old man said. "One visit short and quiet shouldn't hurt him." Kennedy agreed. Setting strict rules, Grace could come for an hour, accompanied by the pastor with Ellis on hand to monitor Faith. When Grace arrived, propped up in a wheelchair, her face gaunt, but her eyes fierce with determination, Kennedy felt a pang of recognition. Faith had looked like that once, clinging to life against the odds. Grace sat by the corral, her hands folded in her lap, watching Faith as he stood close, his head lowered as if in acknowledgement. She didn't speak much, just whispered a prayer, but when she left, her shoulders were straighter, her smile faint but real. A week later, the pastor called. Grace was walking short distances, her pain less crippling. Ellis, checking Faith after the visit, found the bull slightly tired but stable, a relief that eased Kennedy's fears. The sanctuary became a quiet haven, its existence known only to a trusted few. Kennedy, Thomas, and Clara worked out a system no more than one visitor a week, only for cases where medicine offered little hope, and always with Ellis's approval to ensure Faith's health. They kept it secret, avoiding the risk of turning Faith into a spectacle. Kennedy knew the world too well. People would come, not just the desperate, but the curious, the opportunistic, eager to profit from a miracle they didn't understand. He'd seen it in politics, the way good intentions could be twisted, and he refused to let that happen to Faith. The bull deserved better, a life of purpose without exploitation. Thomas took on the role of guardian, living in the cabin and tending to Faith with a care that bordered on devotion. "Lila would have loved this," he said one day, watching Faith drink from the creek. "A place where he can be what he's meant to be." Kennedy nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper. This wasn't just about Faith. It was about what the bull had taught him about the power of a single act of compassion. One afternoon, as Kennedy helped Thomas repair a fence at the sanctuary, Clara arrived with a letter. It was from James now, back in New Orleans, his cancer in full remission. The letter was brief but heartfelt, thanking Kennedy for the time at the ranch for Faith. "I don't know what happened in that barn," James wrote, "but I know I'm here because of it. Tell that bull he's got a friend for life." Kennedy folded the letter, his throat tight. He thought of Ellie now, healthy and fearless, of Rosa, who'd sent him a homemade pie as thanks of grace, whose latest doctor's visit showed progress no one could explain. Each story was a thread weaving a tapestry of hope, but also a reminder of the delicate balance they had to maintain. Faith, grazing nearby, lifted his head, his eyes meeting Kennedy's with that same knowing look. Kennedy walked over, resting a hand on the bull's shoulder. "You've done more than I ever could," he murmured. Faith snorted softly, as if to say the work wasn't done. That evening, Kennedy gathered Clara, Thomas, and Sam at the ranch house, sharing a simple meal of gumbo and cornbread. He'd invited Sam, who'd become a regular at the sanctuary, reading to Faith and helping with chores. Over dinner, Kennedy spoke, his voice steady but earnest. "What we've got here with Faith, it's bigger than us. He's not just an animal, he's a reminder of what matters. Compassion, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back, can change lives. But it's not free. We've seen what it costs him, and it's our job to protect that balance, to make sure his gift isn't drained dry." He looked at each of them, seeing their nods, their quiet agreement. This isn't about miracles or fame. It's about doing right by something that's trusted us with its strength. Sam, usually shy, spoke up, like how my grandpa used to say, "You take care of the land, and it takes care of you." Faith's kinda like that, right? Kennedy smiled, struck by the boy's insight. "Exactly, Sam. We take care of Faith, and he takes care of those who need him." The lesson wasn't just for them. It was for anyone who'd listen. A truth Kennedy had learned the hard way. Compassion was a force powerful enough to heal, to connect, to transform, but it demanded respect, a mindfulness not to overstep. He thought of his own life, the years spent navigating the rough waters of public service, where compassion often took a back seat to pragmatism. Faith had shown him another way, a quieter path, where one act, saving a dying bull, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he'd never imagined. He wanted others to understand that to see that kindness, when given thoughtfully, could be a legacy. For the community around the ranch, it meant looking out for each other, sharing burdens, protecting what was sacred. Whether it was a neighbor, a piece of land, or a bull with a gift, no one fully understood. As the meal ended, Kennedy stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against his skin. The sanctuary was just visible in the distance, a soft glow from Thomas's cabin cutting through the dark. He thought of Faith resting under the oaks, and felt a quiet pride. They'd built something good here, something that honored the bull's purpose while safeguarding his life. The stars above were bright, and for a moment, Kennedy swore he saw a faint shimmer like the glow he'd glimpsed around Faith months ago. He didn't question, it didn't need to. Faith had taught him to trust what he felt, to act with care and courage. That was the lesson, the one he'd carry forward. Compassion given wisely could light the way not just for one man or one bull, but for anyone willing to listen. And as long as Faith was in his care, Kennedy would make sure that light never went out.